Right, okay, so our last video we left off with GDP, gross domestic product, um, where we learnt that it's when you produce and sell within a country in order to bring up the country's uh, wealth, I guess we'll put it in that way, GDP in total. So then there was a graph in that showing about K-shaped economy. What is a K-shaped economy? Not from my understanding, because what we're going to do, we're going to get into this video so we can hopefully get a broader understanding of what that actually means. So without further ado, this is what makes K-shaped recovery scary. I'm hoping they're going to explain what they mean by K-shape in this video as well. Hopefully they should. If not, we'll find another one. But let's jump into it. Let's go.
Making some people richer. The economic impacts of the COVID pandemic are bad. But not for everyone. This crisis is actually making some people richer. Now some of you would ask, is this really happening? And is the economy seeing a K-shaped recovery? Well, let's find out. But before going ahead, hit the subscribe button. And trust me, you won't regret that.
So where they
First, we will see what is a K-shaped recovery.
Right.
For start, it is similar to any other recovery like V or U. First, the graph of economic growth goes down drastically.
Okay.
But while recovering, this graph splits in two ways like the letter K.
Got you.
One line goes up and the other down.
Wealth in the
This
poor.
type of recovery was seen in the 2008 financial crisis. And now in this pandemic we are seeing a similar pattern. So, first let's talk about the line which is going upwards in the K. The ones who grew were mostly big companies and wealthy people. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google are some of the biggest names on this list. These four companies combined made profits of $28 billion in just one quarter. Also, the pharma and medical equipment industry saw a major surge due to the pandemic.
Of course they did.
Apart from this, retailers like Walmart saw massive growth in their income. And if you talk about individuals, giants like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and many others added nearly $640 billion to their net worth during this pandemic.
Goodness me.
Now, did every big company or individual become richer? The answer is no. And this question takes us to the line going down in the K. Industries like fashion, hospitality, tourism, and entertainment saw a major decline. Along with these, small and medium-scale businesses, or startups also saw a huge downturn.
Central.
Also, the working-class individuals, small business owners, and the informal sector workers were hit badly. So this takes us to our next point. Unemployment. Well, in the case of unemployment, the informal sector saw a very bad decline with maximum job losses. And 60% of the world works in this sector. Although government help like stimulus packages for unemployed people work for now. But it has a
Printed
limit.
money.
Also, the idea of work from home is working for most of the companies, which is a good thing. But due to this, companies realize that most of the office work can be done from anywhere in the world. So, they may consider cheaper options like the Philippines or India in the future. And this could lead to job losses in Western countries.
That's interesting because we're hearing now these companies are wanting their employees back in the office multiple times a week because they feel the productivity level declines once you're at home. So they're trying to bring everyone back in. Hence why we've got a lot of offices being built, office spaces, etc.
Now, to avoid the devastation of the economy, governments across the world are putting money in the market by various stimulus packages, and by offering low interest rates. This is a good thing. But doing this excessively could cause inflation in the market. So governments should know how, and when to recover money from the economy. Although, increasing taxes is one of the ways they could use. So, what we can do to save ourselves from economic downturns like this? Well, it is easy. People need to save more money when the economy is prospering. According to a survey, 60 to 70% of Americans do not even have $1,000 in their savings. And when the tough time comes, people go bankrupt, or lose their house or any other valuable assets. So, people around the globe need to have proper knowledge about investments and emergency funds.
Right.
In the future, these kind of problems are likely to happen more. And we must be prepared for that. As whenever the economy sees a downturn, the difference between rich and poor increases. And the same thing is happening now. Wealthy individuals or big companies are going up, but small businesses and regular wage earners are seeing a fall. And this is what makes the K-shaped recovery much scarier than others. So, what are your views about this video? Let us know in the comments section below. And we are glad you watched the full video. Please hit the subscribe button and give Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Google or to any other recovery.
Okay, so we got the synopsis of what a K-shaped economy looks like. It's when the economy goes down, unemployment, stocks, anything where there's a drastic movement within the society goes down. Then you get two groups to separate that. The wealthy get wealthier. The working class, poorer ones continue to get poorer. We've defined the K-shaped economy. It hasn't hit home right now, I'd say, but it's good to be aware of for the upcoming seasons. We're now going to take a nosedive into what did we want to see? I want to see what let me see something actually. Playlist, watch later. Before we get into these, I feel we need to get a more understanding whenever they mention things. So it was quantitative spending explained. What is quantitative easing? Okay, this morning, bro. Gonna explain what is quantitative easing. Okay, we'll try these two.
This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Go to skl.sa. Easing is US, UK, Eurozone, and Japan are just some of the countries that have implemented the unconventional monetary policy as a way of helping their economies recover from the recession. But what exactly is quantitative easing? Well, the short of it is that it involves printing money, which is thought to encourage business activity. But it's a little more complicated than just creating dollar.
Another one. The Economist explains.
On September the 13th, the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, announced a new program of quantitative easing, the creation of money to try and boost the economy. Like Pavlov's...
When was this published? 13 years ago. This video is 13 years ago. Let's see how it can relate today in 2026.
Dogs, the stock market selling to try and boost the economy. Like Pavlov's dogs, the stock market salivated, as it has done on the previous occasions the Fed announced similar measures. Are these rounds of monetary easing actually necessary, and will they succeed in boosting the global economy? Quantitative easing involves the creation of new money, not the literal printing of money as used to occur, but the creation of money with a click of a computer mouse.
Right.
When an investor sells government bonds or another asset to the central bank credits the bank account of that investor with new money. The aim is to encourage investors to leave safe assets like government bonds and invest in riskier assets like shares. And it's also to stimulate lending in the economy by keeping interest rates low. Does quantitative easing work beyond lifting the stock markets in the short term in a kind of sugar high? In the long run, critics fear that the effect of expanding the money supply, having more money chasing fewer goods, will be to create inflation. The positive case for quantitative easing is that it has prevented a very deep recession indeed. Although central banks may be creating money, the biggest source of money creation in the economy traditionally has been the commercial banks, and they have been destroying money by shrinking their balance sheets. The best way of thinking of it is as a bath. As the central banks are pouring in money through the taps, the banking system has pulled out the plug at the other end. And the net effect, if you look at the total amount of money in the system, particularly in Europe, is a balance. The money supply is barely growing at all. So without QE, the argument is, the money supply will be shrinking very rapidly, just what happened in the 1930s and what led to the Great Depression. To sum up, quantitative easing is a controversial policy and an untested one, but the economist's view is that it's worth a try. The authorities have few other options, and the danger is that if they do not act, the world could fall into a very deep recession.
Which led me to why I wanted to look into the Great Depression and how that was caused. Nice brief video there, but we'll give this guy a chance as well, just to get a bit more understanding.
This video
on it.
is sponsored by Skillshare. Quantitative easing is something we've seen pop up around the world ever since the 2008 financial crisis. The US, UK, Eurozone, and Japan are just some of the countries that have implemented the unconventional monetary policy as a way of helping their economies recover from the recession. But what exactly is quantitative easing?
Yeah, what is it?
The short of it is that it involves printing money.
Printing money.
Which is thought to encourage business activity. But it's a little more complicated than just
Which is thought to what?
Which is thought to encourage business activity. But it's a little more complicated than just creating dollar bills and tossing them from a helicopter to cheering crowds and businesses below. The central bank will use the newly created money that it produces to purchase assets from the market. And while this isn't different from what the institution actually typically does, it's the scale and the type of assets involved that makes quantitative easing so unconventional and, quite frankly, controversial. So let's go through how quantitative easing works and what it means for the economy on today's Plain Bagel.
What is quantitative easing?
A country's central bank, like the Federal Reserve in the US and the Bank of Canada in Canada, is the steward of the country's currency. They are intended to be an independent institution from the government. And among their responsibilities is the task of actually issuing money and managing its supply, while simultaneously helping the economy maximize employment and stabilize prices. So when a country starts to show signs of a slowing economy, the central bank will typically step in to try and boost business activity through expansionary monetary policy, which involves influencing the country's currency to encourage more spending and lending.
Got you.
One way they do this is by changing their policy interest rates, which you hear about in the news quite a bit, especially within the last decade. By lowering interest rates they pay on their deposits that they receive from other banks, the central bank applies downward pressure to other interest rates within the economy. From interest rates paid on government bonds and corporate debts to car loans and mortgages that you or I might take out. The idea is that a lower cost of borrowing will encourage spending, which is a fair assumption. If you were going to buy a house, for example, you might be more inclined to make a current purchase if you could borrow at a lower interest rate. Whereas if interest rates were higher, you might decide to hold off and, at the very least, increase the down payment you make before making the purchase so that you don't have to borrow as much and pay the expensive interest rate that you're going to be charged.
Right.
Low interest rates have prevailed in most developed countries since the 2008 financial crisis. But as you would expect, interest rates can only go down so far. In the US and Canada, the central bank interest rates are in the low single-digit range. And in the Eurozone and several other countries around the world, rates are actually in the low negative range. And so with little to no leverage left in that department, many central banks have implemented or considered expanding quantitative easing programs, first started a decade ago, as a way to continue stimulating their economies. Quantitative easing, or QE as it's commonly referred, is the process by which the central bank injects money into the economy. But while it's often imagined as a central bank printing dollar bills and giving them to banks and corporations, it's not that simple. Firstly, the move is actually mostly digital, with the central bank simply crediting themselves electronic funds. And the money enters the economy through open market operations. That is, the central bank inserts itself into the market as a buyer and purchases securities and assets using its new money, typically buying
the new money it just magically printed. Great job, central bank.
government bills and bonds, securities, and assets using its new money, typically buying government bills and bonds from other banks. This action increases an economy's money supply. By buying the assets, the central bank is replacing them with new money, as if pulling the funds from an alternate dimension and injecting them into the economy. The process also leads to the central bank increasing or expanding its balance sheet, since it will end up holding financial assets. So, why does the central bank consider doing this? What's the benefit of buying financial assets from the market? Well, one of the main objectives of QE is to lower the costs of borrowing, i.e. they're looking to ease a country's financial markets. This is done during periods where financial markets are tight, or when banks are more reluctant to lend, like after the financial crisis when the credibility of many businesses and organizations became less certain. Now, when overnight rates are near 0% from the central bank's influence, banks already borrow at a cheap cost, but the rates they turn around and charge on other longer-term loans may still be high. So by increasing money held by the banks, which is sitting around not earning a very high return, the hope is that the banks will be more willing to lend out to businesses and consumers. And since there's more banks with more money to lend, they will ideally compete and lower interest rates, making it easier for market participants to borrow and spend, thus theoretically saving the economy. This is why higher money supply is thought
So let me get this right with the quantitative easing situation. The main central bank, by the touch of a button, creates money out of thin air, buys assets from the local banks, national banks, with that invisible money, gives it to them because I've just bought it. They then receive the asset, keeping it for themselves. And that's how this printed money is then shared out. This money which came from nowhere. The only one winning here is the central bank. Ooh. You've done it now. Hold on. Let's continue on. See how this leads to inflation.
Theoretically, making it easier for market participants to borrow and spend, thus theoretically saving the economy. This is why higher money supply is thought to lead to lower interest rates. Money becomes easier to come across, so it costs less to borrow. QE can also decrease interest rates by lowering the yields on financial assets. As a quick refresher, yield is the income return an investor receives when they purchase an investment. It's interest or dividend payments divided by the price paid, the market price. By buying financial assets like treasury bills, the central bank increases its price by bidding it up, thereby lowering its yield with interest rates remaining constant. This has a number of effects. For one, it can make it easier for the government to borrow money moving forward. For example, imagine the government has issued $1,000 treasury bills that pay $20 annually, so a 2% annual interest rate. And the central bank has bid up the price of outstanding treasury bills to $1,100. So they now only offer a yield of 1.8% to new investors. Because outstanding treasury bills only offer a 1.8% return to investors, the government could issue future treasury bills that pay, say, $18 annually and still offer a competitive rate, lowering their own cost of borrowing and allowing them to spend more. In this way, QE can actually help a government pursue fiscal policy, whereby the government increases spending to directly increase economic activity. Another effect of this is that it encourages more investment in riskier assets. Since government debt, which is fairly not risky, offers a less attractive return, investors may look to sell treasury bills and bonds to purchase higher yield corporate bonds and stocks, something that can help boost the stock market and improve capital market conditions, again making it easier to borrow money. So that's why central banks might pursue QE. But what we've described isn't much different from the standard open market operations carried out by central banks. In fact, purchasing treasury bills is one of the standard mechanisms used by the Federal Reserve for managing the federal funds rate in the US. What makes QE different is its scale and the fact that it can span other financial assets outside of government debt. In the US, for example, the Federal Reserve found itself adding almost $4 trillion to the US economy after 2008. And from 2009 to 2010, the central bank bought just over $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities, an investment that became unpopular and risky due to its exposure to the housing market. This not only helped boost money supply, but it unloaded unwanted assets from the banks, with the hope that it would improve confidence in the housing market and allow banks to continue providing mortgages to home buyers. Sounds like a pretty solid win-win, right? An institution that can print money buys assets investors don't want.
It's daylight robbery.
The economy. What could go wrong? Well, as with most things in economics, the action is not without its own risks and downsides.
Of course.
For one, QE can lead to runaway inflation. Inflation is when the value of a currency falls. With more money in circulation, each dollar becomes less valuable, leading to rising prices. QE will most of the time cause inflation, and while most developed countries target a low single-digit inflation rate, they may accidentally push inflation much higher, potentially causing a crisis when QE is implemented. Secondly, injecting money into the economy may not necessarily lead to higher business activity. After all, the central bank can't force banks and businesses to use their newfound liquidity. And if institutions don't have confidence in the stability of the economy, they may simply hoard their newfound cash. This is part of the reason why Japan has continued to experience deflation, even after implementing QE programs and boosting money supply quite a bit. And even US banks were found to have held quite a bit of the money they received from the post-2008 program rather than lending it out. Finally, QE programs are not intended to be permanent. Once the economy has recovered, gotten back on its feet, and inflation starts to rise, the central bank will often reverse its QE program, selling assets back into the market, shrinking or unwinding its balance sheet, and sterilizing or destroying money it receives to reduce money supply and keep inflation in check, effectively putting money back into the alternate portal it pulled it from. But the timing of this step is just as important as the decision of implementing QE. If done at the wrong time, it can make a bad situation much worse, taking away a crutch businesses and banks have come to rely on. Now, QE is thought to have helped quite a bit with the post-2008 recovery of countries around the world, according to institutions like the IMF. But we have yet to see countries fully reverse the programs they put in place. The US Federal Reserve's balance sheet still has roughly $4 trillion worth of assets, up from around $1 trillion in 2008. So while the process can support a country and bring cash to businesses in need, it requires extreme caution and care if a country wishes to maintain confidence in its economy and, importantly, its currency. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to hit the like button. And if you like what we're doing here, make sure to subscribe. Hit the bell icon if you want notifications about future videos. If you have any feedback or topics you want me to cover in a future video,
it's the pros and cons. The pros and cons and knock-on effects of this, of the QE.
Hey, have you heard of Skillshare?
Pros and cons. What's your spending? Pros and cons. Advantages and disadvantages of QE. Click this quickly.
Okay, hi there, and welcome to a macro video. And in this short video, we're going to take a look at some of the main advantages and the main disadvantages of quantitative easing, otherwise known as QE. The current background in 2019 ahead of the exams is that in the UK context, the Bank of England's quantitative easing programme, QE, now values £445 billion worth of assets, the vast majority of which has been the purchase of government debt, government bonds, £10 billion of commercial debt bought by the Bank of England. Quantitative easing, QE, is where essentially the central bank introduces new money into the national supply by creating new money electronically. They use this money to buy assets, as we see mainly bonds.
Yeah.
They buy those government bonds from commercial banks, from insurance companies, from pension funds. They buy them from people and institutions who hold bonds. That increases the demand for bonds in the bond market, and because there's an inverse relationship between the price of bonds and interest rates, that causes the yield on a bond, the rate of interest, to fall. Typically, those people who've sold their bonds, a commercial bank for example, well, that gives the commercial bank extra cash or liquidity. A pension fund may sell some government debt to the Bank of England and use the money, the funds, to buy perhaps some shares of listed companies, or perhaps to buy some corporate bonds or some property. Crucially, commercial banks receive cash from the sale of bonds to the Bank of England. That increases their liquidity. In theory, that then allows them more latitude, more freedom, more scope to lend out to businesses and households. The key takeaway point is that QE means the Bank of England is buying government bonds. That increases their price and drives down the interest rate on bonds. QE works through several channels, through wealth, because lower interest rates leads to higher share prices. It in theory lowers the cost of borrowing. The government, for example, can issue new debt at a slightly cheaper rate of interest. It works through lending, if the commercial banks lend out extra money to a queue of businesses looking to expand. And crucially, often missed by students, QE works through the exchange rate. If interest rates in the UK are lower, again, in theory, that brings down the exchange rate, perhaps through an outflow of hot money. In this video, I'll quickly take you through 4 advantages of QE, and then I'll counterbalance with 4 disadvantages and make 4 evaluation points. So if you've got your revision notes on QE around, here we go. The first advantage of QE is that it gives the central bank, Bank of England, European Central Bank, for example, it gives them an extra instrument or an extra tool of monetary policy. Perhaps they've cut interest rates to 0, they can't cut them any further. It gives them an extra club in the golf bag, an extra thing that they can change. Secondly, if you increase the size of the monetary base, increase the money supply, in theory that helps to avoid the severe risk of deflation, particularly in the event of a major external economic shock, such as we saw 10, 12 years ago. Most economists believe that without QE, in the UK and in the United States, for example, the decline in output and jobs would have been much bigger, but for QE. QE reduces interest rates, so a third advantage is that should help to stimulate business confidence, as well as giving commercial banks some extra money to use for lending. And the fourth advantage is that QE, again in theory, can help make a country more competitive overseas, particularly if it leads to a depreciation of the exchange rate, which then makes their export industries more price competitive. So there we have 4 advantages of QE. What about the other side of the argument? Well, here are 4 disadvantages of QE. The first is that QE is widely regarded as having caused an increase in wealth inequality, because the low interest rates and the increased money circulating around the economy, a lot of that has gone into equities, but a lot of it has gone into property speculation, and that has increased house prices as well as the cost of renting property. So QE may well have made the geographical immobility of labour and housing affordability issues more acute. Again, in theory, if you increase the money supply, there's always a threat, at least, that could lead to higher inflation in the years ahead. That's the second disadvantage. A third disadvantage refers to the Hayekian or the Austrian School of Economics. If QE keeps interest rates particularly low, if you like, lower than they would otherwise have been, Hayekians, Austrians argue this distorts the market for capital, distorts incentives, and can keep alive unproductive zombie companies who can roll over their debt and keep paying low interest rates. And a fourth disadvantage of QE is that with interest rates lower as a result of it, the annual incomes, if you like, from pension funds go down. So the annuities that pension funds can offer to people who've saved are much lower. And that certainly makes life tougher for people who rely on their savings in retirement, and crucially those who rely on their occupational pension. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of some of the disadvantages of QE if an essay comes up. Of course, it's really important to be able to evaluate QE. Here are 4 points. The first is that we're not sure what the time lags are and what, if you like, the impact, the elasticity of QE is on the real economy. It's quite hard to isolate the effects of QE on things like GDP and growth and interest rates, because in any macroeconomy, there are so many moving parts changing all the time. Second evaluation point is, as a result of QE, the Bank of England is now a major holder of UK government debt, and that has consequences, I think, for the difference between monetary and fiscal policy in the UK.
Right.
Some economists are saying, well, 10 years on from the first generation of QE, perhaps we should be a bit more imaginative. Instead of the Bank of England just buying, for example, existing government bonds off the banks and pension funds, perhaps we could move to green QE or people's QE. So using QE, Bank of England could fund green infrastructure projects, big state investments in education and social housing, and ramping up investment in health and social care. Perhaps we can use QE for a social purpose, an environmental purpose, especially given the proximity and the pressing nature of climate challenges. My final point is that QE has certainly helped to keep interest rates very low in the UK, base interest rates and bond yields. A good evaluation point is to say, well, is the UK economy now too dependent on cheap money? Shouldn't 10 years after the last recession, shouldn't interest rates be closer to a normal level 3 or 4, possibly 5%. Perhaps the UK needs to move back towards normal interest rates so that you have more flexibility if economic conditions worsen. QE, quite complicated, certainly well worth knowing quite a bit about, and providing you've got some good advantages and some good disadvantages in your notes, I think you'll be in good shape for the exams. So thank you.
Bit of a hard one to get a head around, that quantitative easing scenario, but okay, look, we covered it. So can we see another? Here's another great impression upon us. Oh yeah, then for another Great Depression 8 months ago. Great Depression, oh yes. We'll probably get a video of it explaining it.
The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in modern history. People went from parties, jazz music, and riches in the roaring 20s to losing their life savings and standing in bread lines in the span of a few years. And the Depression wasn't just in America. Its impact spread across the world and ultimately led to the start of World War II. But what exactly caused the Depression, and what lessons can we learn from it? Let's start in 1918. World War I has just ended, and American soldiers are returning home having won the war. Ah, it feels good to be back. During the war, women had for the first time begun to enter the workforce, and with men returning now, the economy saw a post-war boom. This economic boom, alongside a growing culture change, created the era known as the Roaring Twenties. Party! At this time in Detroit, Michigan, a man named Henry Ford would revolutionize transportation with the Ford Model T car. Facing huge demand for the car, his company introduced the process of the moving assembly line. This mass production dropped the car's price from $780 in 1910 to $290 in 1924, making it the first inexpensive car for the masses. By 1927, the 15 millionth Model T would roll out of the factory. You get a car, you get a car, everyone gets a car. Many companies would copy this assembly line process to mass produce other inventions, including the radio, washing machine, and vacuum. With mass production of new products and improved advertising using the radio, the age of consumerism had officially begun.
There it is.
Everyone wanted the latest and greatest new product. To help with the demand, banks began giving out loans more freely to people, so that they could buy these new products on credit with money they didn't yet have. Times were good. People were partying, there was jazz music, and a spirit of social liberation. Good to see you at the party, old sport. Prohibition had started in 1920, but meant little to this new generation. The parties were bigger, the morals were looser, and Wall Street became the place to be. From 1921 to 1929, the US stock market increased sixfold, driven by the post-war boom, easy credit, and all the demand for new consumer products. As the public learned about these incredible returns from the stock market, everyone began putting money in and talking about it more. This created a snowball effect, where as the stock market continued to go up, people began to blindly sink all their savings into stocks, and some even took out loans, which further drove prices up. When people believe no price is too high for a stock, that can be a warning sign that the price is no longer based on fundamentals, and may have been driven up to irrational levels. Although stock prices were reaching new highs, something wasn't right. By the mid-1920s, the economy and demand for products had slowed drastically. With Europe still recovering from the aftermath of World War I, and few countries being able to afford the new consumer items, global trade was stalling. This didn't matter as people were still overwhelmingly optimistic and expected the stock market would continue to see record yearly performances each year. Extreme greed and unrealistic fantasy filled the air. With margin, people could even buy stocks for only 40 to 10% of the actual stock price, and then pay off their loan when the stock sold for large profits. I would like to take out a loan. Sure, what for? A house, a business, a farm? To buy stocks. Fine by me, here you go. By 1929, 40% of US consumer debt was being used to purchase stocks.
Right.
In that same year, the US had just elected a new president, Herbert Hoover, who famously said, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us." To many people, a skyrocketing stock market was a sign of a healthy, booming economy. But things were about to take a dark turn. Catastrophe would hit. On October the 24th, 1929, a day that became known as Black Thursday, the stock market would see heavy liquidation, with a record 12.9 million shares sold, and the entire stock market fell 11%. This day marked the beginning of the Great Depression, and the following week there would be Black Tuesday, where the market fell 12%, with a record-breaking 16.4 million shares sold.
So
Eventually,
wait. So are we saying that by the purchase of stock in the stock market is what then makes the market drop as a whole? We're buying the stocks and then gotta look into that. How purchasing stock affects the stock market.
the record-breaking 16.4 million shares sold. Eventually, in the span of 2 weeks, stocks had lost about a third of their value. People who had borrowed money to invest were crushed, and many people lost their life savings. However, the worst was yet to come. The common belief is that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression, but this is not entirely true. The stock market triggered a recession, but the real cause of the Great Depression was that many banks had extended too many bad loans and were speculating too much. At this time, many US banks were small and independent shops that lent out a large amount of their assets to people for stock market speculation. As the stock market crashed, these banks went out of business overnight. There was no deposit insurance at the time, so if a local bank closed its doors, people lost their money. With headlines of many banks shutting down, people began to panic and pull their savings from healthy banks. This created bank runs on otherwise healthy banks that had to turn around and try to get all their customers' money all at once. This became a serious problem when in New York City, a false rumor started that the Bank of the United States refused to sell a man's stock. This was enough to cause over 25,000 people to crowd the bank, and by the end of the day, $3 million had been withdrawn from the bank. Fear was in the air, and worried of a larger bank run they couldn't handle, the Bank of the United States closed its doors and asked the state to take over the bank's assets. Soon after, the bank failed to get support for a short-term loan to stop the bank run and would ultimately close its doors for good. It accounted for a third of the total $550 million deposits lost in the Depression. This sent shockwaves across the banking industry, and many banks began to call in loans and sell assets in order to stay liquid. 1/3 of banks in America would ultimately fail in this time period. Hey Joe, I just sold my car and have a few bucks now to pay you back. Which bank are you with again?
Are you crazy? Not a chance I'm leaving my money in any of those banks again.
With people choosing to hold their money outside of banks, the money supply in the US declined 31% from 1929 to 1933. And deflation has devastating effects on an economy. By causing the value of money to go up, it reduces consumers' willingness to spend money, discourages investment, and increases the burden for those in debt. All of this leads to wages and income falling. And through this all, the Federal Reserve stood back, allowing this money supply contraction and the banking failures to happen without any intervention. a crucial mistake that has been widely criticized for making the Depression much worse than it needed to be. Through all of this, US President Herbert Hoover had no idea how to fix this and would largely be blamed for the lasting duration of the Depression. Following the initial stock market crash, there was a growing sentiment for isolationist and protectionist policies. In 1930, he passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act to protect US farmers and other industries from foreign competitors. It increased tariffs on foreign imports to the US by about 20%, which then immediately led to 25 countries retaliating and putting their own tariffs on American goods. Global trade would plummet even further from this, declining 66% worldwide from 1929 to 1934. Global trade was a relatively small piece of the American economy at the time, but this policy only made things worse. In total, the Great Depression would last over 10 years and mark the worst economic downturn in the history of the modern world. The Dow Jones would fall 90% from its high in 1929, and many lost their jobs as companies shut down en masse. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out, over 9,000 US banks had failed, industry halted, and unemployment in the US reached 24.9%, its highest point in history. To make matters worse, there was a period of severe dust storms in the middle of the US that caused drought, high winds, and hurt many farms in what became known as the Dust Bowl, the worst man-made ecological disaster in American history. As farming in the US slowed down, and with 1/3 of Americans still in agriculture, this would have massive consequences. Homelessness and breadlines became a common sight. In America, there would be 34 million people without any income. Shantytowns began appearing across the country and got the nickname Hoovervilles after the now disgraced president. Could it get any worse? In 1932, the US elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised drastic changes and action to get the country out of the Depression. With the New Deal program, for helping the needy, he established a minimum wage, overtime pay, unemployment insurance, and a social security program. As for major banking reforms, he enacted federal deposit insurance on bank deposits to help prevent bank runs. And he also added the Securities and Exchange Commission for better reporting and scrutiny on public companies. FDR's New Deal programs helped to stabilize the banking industry and restore the public's confidence. However, it would still take several years for the US economy to fully bounce back. With other countries around the world having also suffered from the Great Depression, this led to the rise of extremist governments, and World War II would begin just a few years later in 1939. It wasn't until the start of World War II in 1939 that the Great Depression truly ended. It was only at this time that the unemployment rate fell below 10%, and the US saw vast stimulus to support war efforts. Economists still argue how much intervention is needed to solve an economic disaster and the effect of the New Deal program. Many of the lessons learned from the Great Depression are still used in the modern day, including the need for a small, stable amount of inflation to boost consumer spending and business investment, an increased role in government spending, and the assistance from the government to boost the economy when a recession occurs. By learning from the past, we can better understand our current economic system and see any potential dangerous parallels in the future. In the end, it was greed that drove people to believe that there was no price too high for a stock and made many banks take on bad loans. And just like all bubbles, an overinflated market always sees the same ending of a painful crash. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more economic videos just like this.
I'll subscribe. I need to
Hi, I'm
again
Chris
learn
Clark.
more about that. But are you telling me that...
The Great Depression was the...
Are we saying that it was the fact that many people took out loans to buy assets is what which led to the Great Depression? That the more stocks they owned and bought, the more it affected the market going down. But yet now, obviously, majority of people won't even think twice about jumping in the stock market because they think it's a gamble. But let alone that, we still get a lot of advertisements on people to jump in and in the stock market and invest. especially with these ISAs, etc. as well. So I don't know if anyone can explain more on this and how it affects that. I mean, that was a great video, but I feel like I have to dive more into a rabbit hole on this. But if anyone can sum it up briefly, please put it in the chat by all means, or in the comment section. But that's enough for today because my head's going with all that information. So yeah, but we'll be back. We'll be back again for some more Riskonomics. In the meantime, take care of yourselves as we transition over to some Warframe.